Nearly 700,000 Rohingya Muslims have fled the Southeast Asian nation of Myanmar in the last 5 months to escape what the United Nations and the United States have labeled an ethnic cleansing. The minority Muslim group accuses the Burmese army of carrying out arson, rapes, and killings. An estimated 6,000 people have been killed in the past month alone, and thousands more continue to flee their villages and cross the border into Bangladesh. The Rohingya have been living in the Rakhine state in Myanmar since before the British Empire. They have faced attacks in the past, but this time they say the government of the Buddhist nation of 53 million is trying to wipe them out. Last week, Reuters published an investigative expose on the systematic destruction of a remote village. 2 of the story's authors were arrested in Myanmar and are now facing over 20 years in jail. For more on this, I want to bring former governor of New Mexico, Bill Richardson. He's also the former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations and, until recently, was a member of the Myanmar government's International Advisory Board. Governor, thanks so much for being with us. You traveled to Myanmar in part to work on the release of these 2 journalists, and you told the New York Times that the country's civilian leader, Aung San Suu Kyi, exploded at you when you raised the issue. Can you describe that interaction for us?
Yes, Tanya. For 30 years, I've been a supporter of Aung San Suu Kyi and her democracy movement. And so when she appointed me to serve on this board, I thought that she would be good in taking tough advice. And I said, look, these 2 journalists, they investigated mass graves. They're in detention. They should be released. They should be treated fairly. And she exploded. And I then sensed that the Myanmar government and Aung San Suu Kyi and the military were not serious about fixing this huge humanitarian problem. It's now 1 million refugees, according to the UN, that have fled into Bangladesh. And there's atrocities, mass graves, human rights violations. It's a huge tragedy that needs international attention. So
is it your sense that Suu Kyi and other leaders there are in denial about calling this crisis by its name?
Yes, they're in denial. You've got the military that's Myanmar military that's perpetrating this crisis. Now, Aung San Suu Kyi, who's been a heroine of human rights in the past, has become a politician. She doesn't want to upset the military that has equal power as she does, especially over national security. So instead of using her moral leadership to say to her own military and to the international community, let's stop these atrocities, let's stop these killings, let's find a repatriation program that treats these refugees, these minorities, the Rohingya, in a safe way. And so, yes, they're in denial. And the international community needs to get more active.
So I think part of what seems to be complicating the matter is that, as you mentioned, Suu Kyi, the civilian leader who's been very celebrated, even winning the Nobel Peace Prize, I think it's complicating this because she's now saying she has limited power over the country's military. How much truth do you think there is behind this statement? And isn't a government that is, at the hands of the military, isn't that then a fascist regime, no longer a democracy?
Well, there is a reality here. She has half the power on domestic affairs. That's our Constitution. The military has power over national security, defense issues. But that doesn't mean, as head of the titular head of the country, she can't, speak out against these atrocities or lean on the military and say, you got to stop doing this. Instead, she's been complicit in these efforts and has not explained to the world what is happening. In fact, she's very defensive. And one of the reasons I quit was I felt I couldn't give frank advice. I wasn't going to be part of a whitewashing commission. Just the way she handled the Reuters journalists who have discovered mass graves, and there are even more mass graves right now. I just think what is needed desperately is more involvement by the great powers, by the European Union, by the United States. The United Nations has been excluded. They should help in this repatriation of these 1 million refugees that need to go back to Myanmar, but they're in Bangladesh with more strains. The Bangladeshi people are getting concerned because the resources going to the refugees, more atrocities there, more militancy created on both sides, more fighting.
Well,
this is a huge crisis.
Let's talk about those refugees for a moment, because many of these families say that Myanmar will never accept them, that there are deep-seated prejudices against the Rohingya. Do you believe that to be true?
Yes, they have been mistreated, but Myanmar is their home. And if the international community, the UN, could set some very safe standards of guaranteeing them citizenship, safety, protection from abuses, yeah, there's a huge task ahead. Bangladesh and Myanmar signed an agreement for 2 years this repatriation would happen. But without safety guarantees, these refugees are not going to go back. So your premise is correct. The problem is that in Bangladesh is a poor country. They don't have the resources to take care of these refugees. There's a presidential election coming up. There's a lot of politics in there. What I think is needed is the UN and international community finding a way to get those refugees back in a safe, human rights way.
Now, you recently, as we mentioned earlier, traveled to Myanmar, part of this group meant to help deal with this crisis. You quit, calling it a whitewash. Can you explain what happened there to us?
Well, the whitewash was because I sensed that Aung San Suu Kyi, on also the mass graves issue, didn't want to hear bad news, didn't want to hear from her friends that this was not going well, did not want to hear criticism of the military. And there was also a trip to the Rakhine area that was organized for our commission, which was going to places the government wanted us to see, not to talk to the Muslim people, not to talk to the displacement camps, just sort of a PR trip. And I wasn't going to be part of that. And it's hurt me because I've worked on behalf of Aung San Suu Kyi for 30 years as a congressman, as a Clinton cabinet member, as I have a foundation that has trained women leaders there. And to have this break is painful, but I couldn't be part of what I think is a whitewashing operation. And what you're seeing now is a Myanmar government unwilling to investigate the mass graves issue, unwilling to let the UN rapporteur on human rights in, unwilling to have the UN Security Council find out what's going on. They're in denial.
So you're saying without international pressure, you believe the government would be happy to see these, 700,000 Muslim refugees just disappear?
Well, I think there are strains in bringing them back. The Buddhist majority in Myanmar, there's a lot of discomfort with these refugees, but that doesn't mean they should be mistreated or waylaid.
Oh, absolutely.
What I think needs to happen is the international community needs to rally to make this right, and that is to treat these refugees correctly, safely, as they move into and should back to their homes.
Do you think that the government there does not hear the international criticism? It seems that they're somewhat isolated from it.
Well, yeah, what I heard when I went on this trip was a condemnation of human rights groups, the international community. The UN is mistreating us. They don't understand our position. And what I think happened with Aung San Suu Kyi, what happens to a lot of powerful leaders, they get in a bubble where all they have around them is people that tell them, oh, how great you are. They don't like to tell them bad news. And I sense when I was just telling some facts, not necessarily I had an agenda. They claimed I had an agenda because I raised the journalists, and they said, well, that's not the charter of the commission. Well, a free press, bedrock of democracy, find out what's happening with the human rights abuses is a function of our commission.
And Bill, what is the status of those two journalists at this point?
Well, they're still in prison. They potentially could face 14 years in prison. There's been all kinds of delays, excuses on their final resolution. But it is clear that they were investigating and they found out about these mass graves, approximately 12 people, and they were reporting on it. I think that was honest reporting.
Yep.
And instead, they were charged with violation of the Official Secrets Act. Hopefully, they'll be released sometime, but it doesn't look good. And this is an outrage. This is not right.
Certainly chilling for the journalistic community. Former Governor Bill Richardson, we thank you for your time.
Thank you.